There's a kind of thirst that doesn't live in your throat. It lives lower, behind the ribs, in the place where you keep the people you're afraid of losing. I felt the ordinary kind, the summer drought kind that cracks your lips and makes the cattle low all night. But the kind that came the year Warwick Hollies closed the headgate on Calder Draw, that one I still feel some mornings before I'm all the way awake. I'm going to tell you what happened out there, not the version they printed in the county paper, which got the dates wrong and the heart of it wronger. The real one, about a man who thought water was a thing you could own like a fence post, about a woman who wouldn't break when breaking would have been easier, and about a 9-year-old girl who wandered off looking for a lost dog and came back holding something that turned the whole valley upside down. I've had 30 years to decide whether I'm the hero of this story or just the old fool who stood at the edge of it. I've made my peace with the answer. Sit down. This one's going to cost you something to hear, same as it cost me to live. The morning it started, I was pulling a dead heifer out of the mud at the bottom of my stock tank, and I was cussing God in a low, private voice so my wife wouldn't hear me through the kitchen window. That's the truth, and I'll set it down plain because the rest of this only makes sense if you understand how dry it was. We were 3 years into a drought that had no bottom. The Calder Draw ran through the middle of our valley like a vein, and every ranch on it, mine, the Ostergaards, the Beckwith place, all of us, drank from the same water that came down off the Sabinosa Rim and pooled behind the old diversion works up at the neck of the canyon. Warwick Hollies owned the neck, owned the headgate, owned the rusted iron wheel that lifted the plate and let the water pass down to the rest of us. He hadn't touched that wheel in 40 years. Neither had his father. Water ran downhill, and it ran to everybody because that was how it had always run, and because nobody in that valley had ever been fool enough or mean enough to think otherwise. I got the heifer out, sat in the mud a while. Then I heard Del Ostergaard's truck coming down the county road too fast, and I knew before he stopped that something had gone wrong, because Del was a careful man, and careful men don't drive like that unless the world's tilted. He shut it, Del said. He didn't even get out of the truck. He leaned across the seat and hollered it through the open window, and his face was the gray of a man who'd seen a coffin. Hollies, he shut the headgate, locked a chain on the wheel. There's no water coming down, Emmett. There's none coming at all. I remember I laughed, not because it was funny, because it was the kind of thing your body does when it can't hold what it's been handed. I stood there in the drying mud with a dead cow behind me, and I laughed like an idiot. And Del just watched me, and neither of us said Anung for a long moment, while a hawk turned circles over the draw like it already knew. I drove up to the neck that afternoon. I want to tell you I went up there full of righteousness, a delegation of one ready to talk sense into a reasonable man. That's not the truth either. I went up scared. Because I'd known Warwick Hollies my whole life, and I'd watched something go quiet and wrong in him after his boy died overseas. And I had a feeling, the animal kind, the kind that doesn't use words, that the man I was going to find at the top of that canyon wasn't going to be moved by sense or by neighborliness or by anything I had to offer. I was right about that. He was standing at the headgate when I came up the track. Tall, still tall at 70-odd, in a canvas coat too heavy for the heat, and he watched me park and get out and walk up to the chain link he'd strung across the works. New chain link, sharp and silver and out of place against all that old iron. Emmett, he said, just my name, like a man checking a box. Warwick, I looked at the wheel. He'd run a logging chain through the spokes and padlocked it to the frame. Above it, behind the gate, I could see the water, dark, held, patient, backed up into a pool that shouldn't have existed. Our water, sitting there doing nothing. You want to tell me what this is? It's mine, he said. The gate's on my land, the pool sits on my land. The old grant, if you go back and read it, says the water at the neck belongs to the neck. My people never enforced it. That was their mistake. I'm correcting it. I stood there. A grasshopper landed on the fence between us, and I watched it instead of him because looking at his face was like looking at a house with the lights off. Warwick, there's 40 families down that draw. There's kids. There's stock. You know what happens with no water in a year like this. I know exactly what happens. And here's the thing I've never forgotten, the thing that still gets into my sleep. He said it gently, not with rage, not with the heat of a man who's been wronged. He said it the way you tell a child that summer has to end. Everybody down this valley took water for granted their whole lives. Took the land, took the rain when there was rain, took my family's forbearance, and never once said thank you. Now they'll learn what it's worth. You want water, Emmett? You come talk to me about price, all of you. One at a time, hat in hand, and we'll see who's still got a spread come fall. I've been in a few fights in my life. I know what it feels like when a thing tips from talking toward hitting. And I felt it tip right there, felt my hand want to close. But behind him was that chain, and behind the chain was that gate, and behind the gate was more water than my whole family would drink in a year, and I understood with a cold and total certainty that my hands weren't going to fix this. Nothing I had was. So I got back in the truck. Worst drive of my life, that one down the canyon. Because I had to go home and tell my wife, and then I had to help tell the valley, and there's no good way to tell people who are already frightened that the thing they were frightened of has come. The woman in this story, and she is the center of it, I was only ever standing at the edge, was named Ruth Calder Marsh. Calder, yes, same as the draw. Her people had settled that water before there was a county to argue over it, before Warwick's grant, before anybody. The Calders had been the biggest name in the valley once, and then a bad generation and a worse bank had ground them down to almost nothing. And by the time I knew Ruth, she was farming 40 leased acres at the low end of the draw with a husband slowly dying of the thing that eats a man's lungs from working other men's fields all his life, and a daughter. The daughter's name was Winona. She was 9 that summer. I want you to hold on to her because she's the one this all turns on, but I have to bring her in the way she came into it. Sideways, a small brown-legged thing at the edge of the grown folks' fear, mostly ignored, which was the exact reason she saw what the rest of us were too frightened and too tall to see. The valley met 3 days after the gate closed. Not at anyone's house. We met in the Beckwith hay barn because it was the only place big enough, and 40-some families came, and I'll tell you the sound of that many scared people in one dim space is a sound I could pick out of any darkness. Low, constant, like water itself, which was the joke none of us could have stood to make. Somebody wanted to cut the chain. Somebody always does. A young man named Cody Reyes stood up and said what half the room was thinking, that there were more of us than there was of him, that we could go up there tonight with bolt cutters and open our own water and let Hollies try to close it against 40 men. And Ruth Calder Marsh stood up. She wasn't big, that's the first thing. You'd have expected the person who stopped that barn cold to be big, and she wasn't. She was a narrow woman with her hair pulled back hard and hands that had never been idle in their life. And when she stood, the whole barn quieted, and I don't fully know why. Something about her. Something about the name, maybe. Calder standing up to speak about Calder water. You cut that chain, she said, and here's what happens. He's got a deed says the gate's his. You break his lock, you're thieves and you're trespassers, and he calls the sheriff, and the sheriff has to come whether he likes it or not, and then it's not 40 families against one bitter old man anymore. It's the law against you. And the law was written by people who own things, for people who own things, and Warwick Hollies owns things and you don't. You'll lose. You'll lose in a way that costs you the land you're trying to save. So we just die, Cody said. We just sit down here and dry up polite. No, and she looked around that barn, slow, and her eyes went over every face, and when they went over mine, I felt it like a hand on the chest. We outlast him. That's the only thing the Calders were ever good at. God knows we were never good at keeping money. We haul water. Every family that's got a well that still gives, we share it. Every truck that runs, we run it. We drive to the county line and we fill every barrel we own and we keep the stock alive one day at a time, and we do it together, and we do not give that man the one thing he wants, which is to watch us come up that canyon one at a time, hat in hand, and beg. Nobody begs. Do you hear me? Nobody in this valley begs that man for water. We'll drink dust first. I have thought about that speech for 30 years. I've decided it was a mistake. A brave, magnificent human mistake. Because outlasting a man who's holding the water is a thing you can only do until the trucks run out of fuel and the county line wells go brackish and the stocks start dropping. And Ruth knew that. I think she knew it even as she said it, but she also knew that the alternative was to break and beg, and some people would genuinely rather die than break. I've known a few. She was the truest of them. We hauled water for 5 weeks. I'm not going to pretend those weeks were noble the whole way through. They started noble. There's a fierce joy in the early days of a shared hardship when everybody's tank is still half full and the trucks are still running, and it feels like the human race pulling together against the meanness of one old man. Kids rode in the beds of the water trucks and laughed. Women who hadn't spoken in years over some ancient slight stood shoulder to shoulder filling barrels. For about 2 weeks it was almost beautiful. Then it stopped being beautiful, The way these things do. The county line wells started giving less. Diesel got dear and then got scarce. A truck threw a rod and there was no money to fix it, and now there were 3 fewer barrels making the run each day. The stock started to go, not dramatically, not all at once, but a heifer here and a horse there, the weak ones first, and every animal that dropped was a family's savings account bleeding into the dust. And underneath it all day and all night, was the knowledge that 4 miles up the canyon sat a pool of water deep enough to swim in, held behind a padlock, going nowhere, doing nothing, while we killed ourselves hauling cupfuls from 20 miles off. That's the thing that grinds a person down, not the lack, the nearness of what you're being denied. I watched Ruth in those weeks. Everybody did. She'd made herself the spine of the thing whether she wanted to be or not, and a spine gets leaned on. Her husband, Tom, was failing fast now. The dust and the worry were finishing what the fields had started, and she'd spend her nights sitting up with him and her days running water, and I never once saw her sit down to eat. I saw her get thinner. I saw the skin go tight over the bones of her face. And I saw her keep that terrible promise. Nobody begged. Nobody went up the canyon. The valley held. And I watched what holding it cost her, and there were nights I drove home hating Warwick Hollies with a purity I've never felt for another living soul. I went up to see him once more in the 4th week. I didn't tell anybody. I told myself I was going to reason with him, and the truth is I was going to beg. I was going to break Ruth's promise for the whole valley because I couldn't stand it anymore. I was going to go up there hat in hand and be the first one to crawl, and I didn't even care. He wasn't at the gate. I found him up at his house, sitting on the porch, and there was a bottle by his chair and a rifle across his knees, not pointed at anything. Just there, the way a man keeps a thing that comforts him. And I stood at the bottom of his steps and I opened my mouth to beg, and what came out instead was, "Does it help?" He looked at me. "The hurting," I said. "Your boy's gone and you're hurting and you found a way to make the whole valley hurt with you. Does it help? Does it make the hole any smaller?" I watched something move across his face, just for a second, and then it closed up again, the lights going off in the house, and he said, very quietly, "Get off my land, Emmett," and I did. I drove home, and I didn't tell Ruth I'd gone, and I didn't tell her I'd almost begged, and I have carried that small cowardice next to all the rest of it ever since. Winona found the dog on a Tuesday. I know it was a Tuesday because Tuesday was when the working truck made the long run and half the valley was gone north, which meant the low end of the draw was empty and quiet, which meant a 9-year-old girl could slip off after a runaway dog into the broken country along the base of the Sabinosa Rim without a single grown person noticing. She was gone until the lights started to fail. The dog was a half-grown cattle pup named Scout, and it had chased something. A rabbit, a scent, the ordinary madness of dogs, up into the rocks where the rim came down to meet the valley floor, into a jumble of red stone and dead juniper that nobody had reason to go into because there was nothing up there. No water, no graze, no use, just rock and shade and the bones of old trees. Winona went after the dog because Winona loved that dog the specific bottomless way a lonely, frightened child loves the one thing in her collapsing world that's still soft and glad to see her. Her father was dying. Her mother was a ghost running water. The whole valley smelled of fear and dust. And there was Scout, who knew none of it, who only knew that Winona's hands were kind. And when Scout ran, Winona ran, because she was not going to lose one more thing that summer. She followed the pup up into the rocks. She called, and somewhere in that maze of red stone, in the deep shade at the base of the rim where the afternoon never reached, she stopped calling. Because she'd heard something. She told me about it herself, years later, when she was grown and I was old. And I'll give it to you the way she gave it to me, because I've never been able to say it better than a woman remembering the moment her whole life turned on its hinge. "It was the sound," she said. "I'd forgotten what it sounded like. We'd been so long without it that when I heard it I didn't even know what it was. I thought it was the wind at first, or my own blood in my ears. This soft, moving, whispering sound coming up out of the ground. And I stood there in the rocks with my heart going like a rabbit, and I followed it, because I had to, because some part of me that was older than 9 already knew, and I came around this big slab of red stone, and there was Scout, standing at the edge of it, wagging his whole back end, looking down. She stopped when she went on. Her voice had gone somewhere far off. Looking down into the prettiest little pool of clear, cold water you ever saw in your life, coming right up out of the rock. Running quiet down into the dark under the rim where nobody could see it and nobody ever had. Just running. All that time. All those weeks we were killing ourselves and killing our animals. It was just running down there in the dark, free, and it didn't belong to Warwick Hollies or anybody. It didn't have a gate on it. It didn't have a chain. It was Calder water, and it always had been older than his grant, older than his gate, and it had been waiting under that rock the whole time for somebody small enough and low enough to the ground to hear it. She was 9 years old. She was standing at the edge of the thing that was going to save the valley, and she didn't fully understand yet what she'd found. But she understood enough. She understood water that summer. Every child in that valley understood water the way children in easier times understand candy or Christmas. And she did something then that I have never stopped marveling at. A thing that tells you everything about what that child was made of, and everything about the mother who made her. She didn't run home shouting. She knelt down at the edge of that pool in the deep cold shade with the dog pressed against her side, and she cupped her 2 small hands and she drank. Just once, just enough. And then she looked around at the rocks and the hidden shade and the secret running water, and some instinct older than her years, some Calder thing bred into her bones, told her that a thing this precious had to be understood before it was announced. That if she came screaming into the valley about water, 40 desperate people would come tearing up here in the dark, and trample it and fight over it, and maybe Warwick Hollies would find some way to say this water was his too. And so instead she marked the way, broke branches, stacked 3 stones on the big red slab, made herself a map in her own head, the careful way her mother had taught her to do everything. And then she took the dog, and she walked home in the last of the light to find her mother. The light was almost gone when she came down out of the rocks. I know because I was there. I'd come down to the low end looking for Ruth, and the trucks were back, and there was already the beginning of a panic starting because somebody had noticed the Marsh girl was gone. Ruth was standing in the yard of her least 40 with her hands pressed flat against her own chest, not calling out, just standing rigid and staring at the rim, because a woman who has already watched her husband start to die does not have any screams left in her for a missing child. She just stands and stares and waits to see which way the world is going to break her next. And then Winona came walking out of the dusk with the dog at her heel and her knees all scraped, and her hands cupped in front of her like she was still carrying water in them. Ruth crossed that yard so fast I didn't see her move, went down on her knees in the dust and grabbed that child and held her hard enough to break something, and I heard the sound she made, and it wasn't a word. It was the sound the whole valley had been holding in for 5 weeks and hadn't let out. And Winona, 9 years old, her face pressed into her mother's neck, said the thing that changed everything. She said it quiet. She said it like a secret, which is what it was, the biggest secret that Dry Country had ever held. She said, "Mama, I found water, and it isn't his." A secret is a kind of water, too. It'll keep you alive, and it'll drown you, depending on how you carry it. Ruth Marsh understood that before the rest of us did. The night Winona came home with wet hands, Ruth didn't gather the valley. She didn't send word up and down the draw that the Calder girl had found a spring. She did the opposite. She took her daughter inside, closed the door, sat her at the table by the one lamp they let themselves burn, and made her tell it slow. Every rock, every broken branch, how deep, how fast, whether the water tasted of iron or of nothing, and then she made her tell it again. I know because Ruth came and got me before dawn. Knocked on my window the way you knock when you don't want a house to wake, one knuckle low. I came out into the cold dark, and she stood there with a canvas water bag over her shoulder and Winona half asleep against her hip, and she said, "Emmett, I need a man I can trust who isn't going to talk. Are you that man or not?" I said I was. I've spent 30 years hoping I was right. We went up in the gray before sunrise, the 3 of us, following a 9-year-old through country I'd ridden my whole life and never once had reason to enter. And I'll tell you, I doubted her the whole climb. I'm ashamed of that now, but I'll set it down honest. A grown man does not easily believe that a child found in 3 days of walking the thing 40 desperate families had failed to find in 5 weeks of dying. I climbed those rocks thinking she saw a seep, a wet spot, a puddle from the last rain that'll be gone by noon, and this poor woman's grief has made her believe her daughters found the ark. Then Winona said, "There," and pointed at 3 stones stacked on a red slab and led us around it, and I heard the sound. I went down on my knees, the same as the child had. I didn't decide to. My legs just did it. And I put my face down to that water and I drank, and it was cold. Cold the way only deep water is cold, water that's been in the dark rock a long time, and it tasted of nothing at all, which is the taste of the very best water there is. I came up with it running off my chin, and I looked at Ruth, and I couldn't say anything, and she nodded like she'd expected exactly this. And Winona stood between us with her arms crossed, looking fierce and proud and terrified. And the dog drank, and the sun came up over the rim and put one bar of gold light down into that hidden shade. And I have never in my life felt closer to something holy. Then Ruth said, "Now we have to decide what we are." I didn't understand her. I said so. She crouched at the edge of the pool and trailed one finger in it, and she talked to the water more than to me. "There's enough here to save the valley, Emmett. Maybe. If it holds. If it doesn't dry back when the pressure changes, if it runs steady, there's enough to keep the stock alive and the people alive till the rains come back. That's one thing this water can be. It can be the thing that saves everybody." "That's what it is," I said. "That's what it plainly is. Ruth, we've got to tell them, tonight. There's families down there watering their kids from a barrel that's near empty." "I know exactly what's down there." She said it soft, but it stopped me cold, because it was the thing she'd said to me in the barn, the same iron. "I've got a husband down there dying and a promise I made a whole valley about not begging. I know what's down there better than you do. So listen to me, because I've been up all night with this and you've had it for 4 minutes. She stood. "There's a second thing this water can be. It can be ours." And there it was, the thing I'd feel the shape of before she named it. The temptation that any human being would feel, standing at the edge of secret water in a dying country. "Nobody knows it's here but us three," she said. "It's on the old commons ground, the broken country nobody deeded because nobody wanted it. It isn't Hollis's, it isn't leased, it isn't anybody's. If I keep it quiet, I can water my 40 acres and my stock off this. I can save Tom, I can keep him in water and keep him alive maybe long enough to." Her voice did something and she made it stop doing it. "I can save my family, just my family. Nobody would ever know there was more than one family's worth here. And by the time it came out, if it ever did, the marshes would be the one green 40 in a dead valley. And we'd have made it. And we'd have earned it, because my girl found it mine with her own 2 feet, while everybody else was too tall and too proud to look at the ground." I stood there, the water ran. Winona watched her mother with an expression I couldn't read. "That's the choice," Ruth said. "Save everybody and maybe there's not enough and we all die together a little slower, or save mine and let the rest go and live with it. Those are the 2 things this water can be, Emmett, and I have been turning them over all night long. And I brought you up here because I could not carry the turning over alone 1 more hour. I want to tell you I said the right thing fast. I didn't. I stood at the edge of that pool and I thought about my own family, my own stock, my own dead heifer in the mud, and God help me, for a moment, one long, ugly, honest moment, I understood exactly why a person might keep secret water secret. I felt the pull of it. Anybody would. Anybody who tells you they wouldn't has never been that thirsty or that afraid." It was Winona who answered, not me. She'd been quiet the whole climb, the whole conversation, the way children go quiet when grown people forget they're listening. And she said, in that flat, clear child's voice that cuts through everything because it hasn't learned yet how to lie, "Cody Rays carried me on his shoulders at the barn so I could see, and Mrs. Ostergaard gives me the top off her milk. And you cried, Mama. When Daddy got bad you cried, and Mrs. Beckwith came and sat with you all night, and I heard her. They're not the rest, they're us." Nobody said anything. The water ran. "You told everybody nobody begs," Winona said. "You said we drink dust before we beg him. So how come it's okay for us to have water and let them beg?" And Ruth Calder Marsh looked at her 9-year-old daughter for a long, long moment, and then she put both hands over her own face and she wept, standing up silent, her shoulders going, and I looked away because a man ought to, and when she took her hands down her face was wet and clear and decided, and she said, "You're right. God forgive me, you're right, and I knew you were right before you said it. I just needed to hear it out loud in a voice I trusted." She wiped her face with the heel of her hand. "We tell them, all of them, tonight." I've thought about that moment more than almost any other in my life. Because the story the county paper told later made Ruth into a saint who never wavered, a woman of pure heart who found the water and gave it freely. And that's a lie, and it's a smaller and a worse thing than the truth. The truth is she wavered. The truth is she stood at the edge of secret water with her dying husband in her mind, and she genuinely, seriously considered keeping it. And then she chose the valley anyway, chose it with her eyes open, knowing what it might cost her own family, talked into it by her own child. That's not a saint. That's something better. That's a person doing the hardest arithmetic there is and coming out on the side of everybody else while every instinct she had screamed to save her own. I trust that Ruth, the saint one I never believed for a second. We told them that night, and I'm not going to draw it out because you can imagine it. The barn again, the same low frightened sound, and Ruth standing up and saying there's water, and the way a word like that goes through a room full of dying people. It was like watching current run through wire. Somebody screamed. A grown man I'd known 30 years sat down on the ground and cried. Cody Reyes grabbed the man next to him and shook him like a rag. But here's what I want you to see, because it's the part that mattered and the part the paper skipped. Ruth didn't just announce the water, she announced the rules. She stood up in that roar and she quieted it with her hands, and she said the spring was small and might be fragile and might dry back if it was abused, and that meant it could not be a thing 40 families fought over. It had to be run, rationed, fair. She laid it out right there, so much per family per day measured, the week's stock watered first, the children's drinking water off the top before any of it went to animals, a watch kept so nobody took more than their share in the dark. She said the Calders had found it, but the Calders did not own it, that it was valley water, commons water, and it would be run as commons, or it would be run by nobody. And a man named Harlan Beckwith, old, hard, no friend of the Calders, a man whose grandfather had likely helped grind Ruth's people down in the bad years, stood up in the back and said loud, "And who decides all this? You. A Calder deciding how the valley shares its water. That's rich." The barn went dangerous quiet. And Ruth said, "No, not me, him," and she pointed at me. I'd like to tell you I was ready. I was not. I nearly swallowed my own tongue. But she'd thought it through the same way she thought everything through, and she said it out so the whole barn heard the sense of it. That she was too close to it, that her family needed water same as anyone, and so she couldn't be trusted to divide it, that it had to be somebody with no Calder blood and no Holly's grudge. Somebody the whole valley had watched be fair over 30 years of small, ordinary things, and that somebody was me. Emmett. The old fool at the edge of the story, handed the middle of it whether he wanted it or not. I didn't want it, I took it. Some things you take because the taking is the only decent thing left. For 11 days it worked. I want to give those 11 days their due, because they were, I think, the finest thing I ever saw human beings do. 40 frightened families ran a fragile secret spring in the dark of a drought, and they ran it fair. They rationed themselves when nobody was watching. They watered the weakest stock first even when it wasn't their stock. Beckwith, who'd sneered at a Calder running the water, ended up standing the midnight watch 3 nights running without being asked, because somebody had to and he was awake anyway with the hate and the fear that keeps old men up, and he might as well be useful. Kids carried buckets. The milk got shared. Tom Marsh got clean, cold water for the first time in weeks, and I watched a little color come back into that dying man, and I watched his wife see it, and I watched her almost let herself hope. 11 days, the valley on its feet, the stock steadying. The barrels filling from a source no chain could close. And then Warwick Hollies found out. He found out because of course he found out. You can't run 40 families up into the rocks every day and not leave a track. And Hollies had a hand named Pryor who rode that country. And Pryor saw the traffic and followed it and came back and told his boss that the valley had water, real water, cold running water up in the Commons Rock, and that they'd been drinking it for near 2 weeks while Hollies sat up at his gate thinking he had them by the throat. I wasn't there when Pryor told him, but I've imagined it 1,000 times. I've imagined the exact moment Warwick Hollies understood that the water he'd chained, the water he'd used to try to break a whole valley, to make them hurt the way he hurt, to make them come to him hat in hand, that water had never been all the water there was, that the land had held more than his grant, more than his gate, more than his grief, that the thing he'd thought he owned, the thing he'd built his whole terrible bitterness around owning, was not ownable at all. I've wondered whether that broke something in him, or whether it just made the broken thing worse. Because Warwick Hollies did not do what a reasonable man would have done. He did not shrug and open his own gate and rejoin the human race, no harm done, the valley saved. No. He came down out of his canyon on the 12th day, in the heavy canvas coat with the rifle across his saddle, and he rode up into the Commons Rock to look at the water his neighbors had found, to look at the thing that had beaten him, and what he did when he got there. There are men who, when they finally lose the thing they've been holding, set it down. And there are men who'd rather smash it than see it belong to anyone else. I didn't know which kind Warwick Holly's was until the 12th day, and by then it was almost too late to matter. I was at the spring when he came. It was my turn on the water. I'd taken more of the watches than I'll admit, because Sleep and I had stopped being on speaking terms that summer. And it was mid-morning, hot already, the good cold shade under the rim full of the sounds of the valley being alive. The Ostergaard girls were filling milk cans. Old Beckwith was dozing against a rock with his hat over his face. Two of the Ray's boys were watering a string of gaunt horses that were finally starting to fill back out. And Winona was there, because Winona was always there now. She'd appointed herself keeper of the thing she'd found, and nobody had the heart or the standing to tell her no. We heard the horse before we saw the man. And something in the way that horse came, slow, deliberate, a walk and not a hurry, made Beckwith sit up and take the hat off his face, and made the Ray's boys go still, and made me stand up from the rock I was sitting on with my heart already climbing. Warwick Holly's rode into the shade of the rim and stopped his horse at the edge of our water and looked down at it, and at us, and nobody said one word. He looked older than he had at the gate 3 weeks before. That's the first thing I noticed. Grief and spite are heavy things to carry, and he'd been carrying both a long way. He sat that horse and he looked at the pool, the clear, cold, running secret of it, the thing that had beaten him. And I watched his face and I could not read it, and the rifle was there across his saddle, not raised, just there, the way it was always there. So, he said finally, to all of us, to none of us, here it is. Nobody answered. What was there to say? I chained the whole valley's water, he said, slow, like a man working out a sum out loud. Sat up there 21 days waiting for you to come crawling, and the whole time you had this. He almost laughed. It wasn't a good sound. You had this the whole time and you never came, not one of you, not one. His eyes moved over us and stopped on me. You came up once, Emmett, asked me did the herding help. And you knew about this even then, didn't you? No, I said, not then, we found it after. After, he nodded like the word confirmed something. After, well. And his gaze came off me and traveled down and found Winona, who was standing at the edge of the pool where she always stood, small and brown-legged and unafraid in the way only a child who has already lost most of what she loves can be unafraid. And who's this? This the one that found it. Leave her be, I said, and I heard the change in my own voice, and so did he. But Winona didn't need me. She looked up at that enormous, bitter old man on his horse, and she said, clear as spring water, "You're the man who took everybody's water." I am, Holly said. Why? And there it was. The question none of us grown, frightened, careful people had ever once put to him plain. We'd cussed at him and hated him and reasoned at him, and I'd asked him did it help, but not one of us had ever just stood in front of the man and asked him why, the way a child asks, expecting an actual answer. And Warwick Holly's looked down at Winona Marsh for a long, long moment, and something in that ruined face came apart. Because my boy died, he said, and nobody came. Nobody in this whole valley came up my road to sit with me. My wife's been gone 20 years and my boy's in the ground overseas, and I sat in that house alone, and not one of these families that drank my family's water for 100 years came up to say they were sorry. So I thought, his voice cracked and he let it. I thought if they won't come to me for grief, they'll come to me for water. I'll make them come. I'll make them need me the way I... He didn't finish it. He didn't have to. The way I needed them. It hung there in the cold shade over the running water, the whole ugly grief-mad heart of it, and I understood then that I'd been wrong to hate him as pure as I had, because there is no such thing as a pure villain, there's only broken people breaking other people, all the way down. Winona took a step toward the horse. Her mother would have stopped her if she'd been there. I should have stopped her. I didn't. We didn't know, Winona said. That you were sad, I didn't know, and I'm 9. Nobody told me the waterman was sad. They just said you were mean. She looked at the pool, then back up at him. You could have just said, you could have come to the barn and said, my boy died and nobody came, and somebody would have come. Somebody always comes. Mrs. Beckwith came for my mama in the night, and she doesn't even like us. And old Harlan Beckwith, standing there in the shade, made a sound I'd never heard him make. Holly stared at the child. His hands were shaking on the reins, and for one moment, I saw it, I'll swear to it till I die. For one moment the whole thing hung in the balance, and it could have gone toward mercy. It was right there. The man was one breath from getting down off that horse and setting the weight down and letting the valley be a valley again. And then his hand moved toward the rifle. I don't think he meant to use it. I've had 30 years to decide, and I've decided he didn't. I think it was the oldest reflex of a cornered animal. The thing you reach for when the grief gets too big and the exit gets too narrow. The hand going to the hard, cold, certain thing because the soft, uncertain thing, the getting down off the horse thing, the being forgiven thing, was more than he could bear. Mercy is heavier than a rifle. Some men can't lift it. But his hand moved toward the gun, and Winona was 10 feet away, and every grown person in that shade went cold and stopped breathing. And old Beckwith, hard mean, no friend to any Calder, stepped in front of the child. Just stepped in front of her. An old man with a bad hip and a lifetime of grudges, and he put his own body between a 9-year-old and a rifle, and he said, not loud, "You've killed enough this summer, Warwick. You killed my bay mare, and you killed the Ostergaard's milk cow, and you damn near killed this whole valley, and I let you, we all let you, because we were scared, and because a part of every one of us thought maybe we had it coming for leaving you up there alone. So maybe we did, but you are not going to touch that little girl. You'll have to come through a used-up old man first, and I'll tell you, Warwick, I am tired enough this summer that I'd almost welcome it." The water ran, nobody moved, and Warwick Hollies took his hand off the rifle. He sat there a moment more. Then he turned that horse slow, and he rode back out of the shade into the killing sun, and he didn't say another word, and we watched him go until the rim swallowed him. And then the Ostergaard girl started crying and couldn't stop, and Beckwith sat back down against his rock like his strings had been cut, and Winona ran to old Beckwith and threw her arms around his neck, this man who didn't like her people, and he held on to her with both arms and put his face in her hair. And I had to walk off a ways and look at the rocks for a while, because a man my age isn't supposed to come apart like that in front of the neighbors. Here's the part the paper got most wrong, so I'll give it to you straight. They wrote it like Hollies rode off defeated, and the valley lived happily ever after on Calder water. It wasn't like that. It's never like that. 3 days after he came to the spring, Warwick Hollies opened his headgate. He did it in the night, alone, told nobody. Del Ostergaard found the water coming down the draw at dawn and thought at first he was dreaming. Hollies had run the logging chain off the wheel and cranked the plate up and let the whole held pool of it come down to the valley, all of it, everything he'd been sitting on for 3 weeks. And he never said why, and nobody ever asked him, because by the time anybody understood what he'd done, Warwick Hollies was gone. Not dead, gone. He put his ranch up with a broker in the county seat, took a price well under what it was worth, and left the valley and never came back. Some say he went to be near where his boy was buried. Some say he just drove till the money ran out. I don't know. I never saw him again, and I've never been able to decide in 30 years whether what he did at the end, opening the gate, giving back all that water, disappearing, was an apology or a surrender or just a broken man finally too tired to hold his grip. Maybe it was all three. Maybe those are the same thing when you follow them down far enough. The rains came back that fall. They always do eventually. That's the cruel joke at the bottom of every drought, that if you can just outlast it, the water comes back on its own. Tom Marsh lived to see the first of it. He died in the spring, easy in his own bed, with clean water on the table and his wife's hand in his and his daughter asleep in the next room. And Ruth told me later that the last thing he said was about the sound of rain on the roof, that he'd been afraid he'd die without hearing it one more time, and now he had. The spring in the Commons Rock ran another 2 years, and then, one summer, it stopped. Just went quiet and sank back into the dark it had come up out of, the way that country's water does, and nobody ever fully understood it and nobody grieved it, because by then the draw was running full again, and the spring had done the only thing it was ever needed to do. Winona used to walk up and check on it after. She told me once she was glad it went back into the rock. It was never really ours, she said. It just came up when we needed it and went back down when we didn't, like it was borrowed, like the land was just lending it to us to see what we'd do. She was maybe 14 when she said that. I've never had a thought that good in my life. I'm an old man now. Older than Warwick Hollies was that summer, which is a strange thing to sit with. The valley's changed. The young ones sold out, the way they do, and there's people on the Calder draw now who never heard any of this and would think I was making it up if I told them. Ruth Calder Marsh lived a long time. She never remarried and she never left that least 40, though she came to own it in the end, free and clear, and she farmed it till her hands gave out. She never once, in all the years I knew her after, mentioned the morning we stood at the spring, and she confessed she'd thought about keeping it. I don't think she was ashamed of it exactly. I think she just made her peace with the fact that the best thing she ever did came with an ugly moment attached to the front of it, and that this is true of most of the best things people do, and that a person who needs their good deeds to be clean all the way through is a person who will never do very many. Winona grew up, of course she did. She's a grown woman now, older than her mother was that summer, and she does something with water for a living, water rights, water law, fighting for the small, dry places against the big, thirsty ones, and I like to think it started that Tuesday in the rocks with a lost dog and a sound she'd forgotten. She came to see me not long ago, sat on my porch. We talked about all of it, the way you do when there's more behind you than ahead. I asked her the thing I'd never asked. I asked whether she ever thought about the moment Holly's hand went toward the rifle, whether it lived in her the way it lived in me. And she was quiet a while, looking out at the draw, at the water running low and ordinary and free the way it's supposed to. And she said no. That wasn't the part she carried. The part she carried was earlier, was her mother up at the spring at dawn, 12 years old in her memory though she'd been 9, standing at the edge of the water with her whole face torn open, choosing. She said that was the picture that never left. Not the rifle, not Holly's. Her mother deciding to be the kind of person she'd have to keep being for the rest of her life and being afraid of it and doing it anyway. That's the part I go back to, Winona said. Not that she was good, that she was scared and she did it scared. That's the only kind of good there is, Emmett. The rest is just people who were never really tested telling themselves stories. The sun was going down behind the rim. She had a long drive. I wanted to tell her that her mother would be proud, and I wanted to tell her that old Beckwith stepping in front of the rifle was the bravest thing I ever saw, and I wanted to tell her that some nights I still dream about the sound of that spring coming up out of the ground in the dark, running free, waiting for somebody small enough to hear it. I wanted to say all of it. But she already knew, and some things you don't say out loud up here in the dry country where every word costs a little water. You just sit on the porch with somebody you love while the light goes, and you let the quiet hold what the words can't. She stood up to go. She put her hand on my shoulder once and she didn't say goodbye. I didn't watch her drive off. I watched the water.